You probably think of beer as a modern thing, a Friday night thing, a stadium thing, a we survive the week thing. But before grocery stores, before restaurants, before refrigerators, and long before anyone had invented the concept of a weekend, human beings were already drinking fermented grain beverages. Not as a luxury, not as a celebration, as a way to stay alive. And here is the part that changes everything. Some researchers believe that humans didn't start farming grain to make bread. They started farming grain to make beer. That agriculture, the single discovery that rewrote the entire trajectory of human civilization, may have begun not in the kitchen, but at the bottom of a clay jar sitting in the sun. This idea has been sitting quietly in archaeology for decades. Quietly, because it's the kind of claim that sounds like an excuse someone invented to feel better about their drinking habits. But the more scientists excavate the ancient world, the stranger and more convincing the evidence becomes. To understand how this could be true, you have to go back. Not a few hundred years, not even a few thousand. You have to go back roughly 13,000 years, to a time when farming didn't exist, cities didn't exist, and most humans had never stayed in one place long enough to watch a seed grow into a plant. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. Small bands of maybe 20 to 50 people moving constantly across enormous landscapes, searching for anything edible. Every calorie was hard-won. Every winter was a threat. You ate what you could find, you carried what you needed, and you went to sleep hungry more nights than not. Life was brutal in ways that are genuinely difficult to imagine. And scattered across those ancient landscapes was fruit, wild berries, fallen figs, overripe plums sitting in cracks of rock under the summer sun, slowly splitting open in the heat. If you've ever left fruit out too long, you already know what happens next. Fermentation is not a human invention. It is a natural process that has been happening on this planet for billions of years. Yeast is everywhere. It lives on the skin of fruit, on grain husks, in the soil, in the air moving around you right now. When yeast contacts sugar and warmth, it begins consuming those sugars and releasing two things: carbon dioxide and alcohol. Ancient humans didn't create fermentation. They discovered it, the same way they discovered most things, by accident, while hungry, while exhausted, while willing to eat almost anything. Imagine eating a handful of slightly fermented berries after a long day of walking through a landscape that is trying to kill you. You feel warm. The ache in your legs softens slightly. The tension you carry in your chest from constant vigilance eases just a little. The world becomes a fraction easier to be inside. Your mood lifts. You sleep well that night. That was not a random experience. It was the beginning of something. And it wouldn't have stayed private. Not in a group of 20 to 50 people who shared everything: food, warmth, danger, and every piece of information that helped the group survive. If one person discovered that certain fermented fruit or rain-soaked grain produced a particular feeling, that discovery moved through the group immediately. It would have been shared, repeated, sought out deliberately. The thing that worked got remembered. The things that worked best got passed down. This is how human knowledge moved before writing existed. Not in books, in behavior, in preference, in the quiet accumulation of "do this again," carried forward by everyone who survived. But here is where this story goes much deeper than most people expect. Our relationship with alcohol doesn't begin with the first human farmer. It doesn't even begin with the first human. It begins millions of years before agriculture, before civilization, before our species existed at all. Around 10 million years ago, something important happened to our ancestors. A genetic mutation appeared in a gene called ADH4, which produces an enzyme responsible for breaking down ethanol in the body. Before this mutation, our primate ancestors metabolized ethanol extremely poorly. Even tiny amounts caused serious problems. After the mutation, they could process ethanol approximately 40 times more efficiently than before. Think about that for a second. 10 million years ago, the primate lineage that would eventually become humans developed a dramatically enhanced ability to handle alcohol. Why would evolution select for this? The answer is fruit. Specifically, ripe, overripe, and fermenting fruit that had fallen to the ground and was beginning to break down. For a primate foraging through a forest, fermented fruit still contained calories, critically needed calories. But an animal that couldn't tolerate even tiny amounts of ethanol would become disoriented, stumble, and become easy prey. An animal that could handle it got the food and kept moving. A biologist named Robert Dudley has called this the drunk monkey hypothesis. The argument that our ancient ancestors were essentially pre-adapted for alcohol millions of years before they ever intentionally brewed a single drop. Not because getting intoxicated was the goal, because tolerating natural fermentation meant access to calories that other animals couldn't safely eat. You can still see remnants of this in our closest relatives today. Chimpanzees in West Africa have been documented repeatedly collecting fermented palm wine from containers that local villagers leave out and drinking it deliberately, sometimes until they show visible signs of intoxication. This isn't accidental. They seek it out. They recognize what it is. They come back for it. The biological machinery that makes alcohol feel the way it does inside a human body is not a modern accident. It is ancient, preserved, and purposeful. So by the time human ancestors began paying closer attention to grain, the brain chemistry was already primed. The body already knew what to do with fermented sugars. The preference was already built in. And grain is where things get genuinely strange. Around 12,000 years ago, humanity began its most dramatic transformation. For most of human history, people wandered. Then, slowly, in a handful of locations across the ancient world, humans began staying still. They started planting, harvesting, storing, building permanent structures for the first time. The standard version of this story, the one in textbooks, says it happened because humans wanted reliable food. They grew tired of endless migration across unpredictable landscapes. They wanted bread. They wanted stability. They planted grain, settled down, and civilization gradually emerged from that decision. It's a clean story. It makes intuitive sense. But a growing number of archaeologists have started asking an uncomfortable question. What if the order was wrong? What if the decision to stay in one place, to cultivate grain, to build the first permanent structures in human history, came not from hunger for food, but from desire for something else? In the 1950s, an archaeologist named Robert Braidwood first raised the possibility that humans may have begun cultivating grain for fermented beverages before they cultivated it for food. The idea was considered fringe at the time, entertaining but probably not serious. Then, the physical evidence began accumulating. In 2021, researchers working at Raqefet Cave in modern-day Israel discovered stone mortars, ancient grinding tools carved directly into rock, dating back approximately 13,000 years. These mortars contained microscopic traces of starch granules and evidence of fermentation, not traces of bread, traces of a fermented grain-based beverage. This predates the earliest confirmed farming settlements in the region by roughly 1,000 years. Humans were fermenting grain before they were systematically growing it. Around the same time period, evidence of fermented beverages appeared at multiple sites across the ancient world. In China, at a site called Jiahu, dating back approximately 9,000 years, chemical residue analysis of ancient pottery revealed a fermented mixture of rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and grapes. One of the oldest chemically confirmed fermented beverages ever found. And then there is Göbekli Tepe. If you've never heard of Göbekli Tepe, you should understand something important. When archaeologists first began uncovering it in the 1990s in the hills of southeastern Turkey, it broke a significant portion of what the scientific community believed it understood about early human civilization. Göbekli Tepe is a massive complex of circular stone enclosures arranged across a hillside. The pillars are enormous, some standing up to 6 meters tall, weighing up to 20 tons each. They are covered in elaborately carved reliefs of animals: foxes, scorpions, vultures, lions, spiders, snakes. The craftsmanship is sophisticated. The scale is staggering, and it is approximately 11,600 years old. That is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids, and it was built before any confirmed evidence of settled agriculture in the surrounding region. Read that again slowly. Humans built one of the most sophisticated structures ever discovered in the ancient world before they were farming, before they had permanent villages, while they were still, officially, nomadic hunter-gatherers. Imagine what it would have looked like to walk toward it 11,000 years ago. A hillside rising out of a dry landscape, stone pillars taller than 2 men stacked on each other, carved with animals you recognized and feared, the smell of something fermenting nearby, the sound of more people gathered in one place than you had ever seen in your life. People who were not your group, not your band, not people you had any natural reason to trust, and yet they were all there. Carving, hauling, shaping, gathering, season after season, year after year. Something was powerful enough to make that possible. Building Göbekli Tepe required sustained, coordinated labor across a period of years, possibly generations. Hundreds of people working together, moving stones of extraordinary size without wheels, without metal tools, without draft animals. That level of organized effort requires two things above everything else: a reason to keep coming back, and a way to keep large groups of people fed and cooperative over extended periods of time. When archaeologists analyzed the remnants found inside Göbekli Tepe's stone enclosures, they found large carved stone vessels capable of holding hundreds of liters of liquid. Residue analysis indicated fermented grain, not grain for eating, grain that had been processed into a beverage, beer, or the closest ancient equivalent. Göbekli Tepe may be the oldest known intentional gathering site ever constructed by our species, and the evidence suggests that what drew people there, fed them, kept them working together, and held the entire enterprise together socially, was communal brewing. This is where the deeper significance of ancient alcohol becomes clear. Human civilization is built on cooperation, and cooperation at scale, between groups of strangers, sustained over months and years, is something that survival instinct alone does not naturally produce. Every human organization in history has needed some mechanism to reduce social tension, build trust between unfamiliar individuals, and create shared identity strong enough to make people work together instead of simply walking away. Modern research has documented something specific about alcohol consumed in social settings. At low doses, it inhibits the neural circuits responsible for threat detection. It increases oxytocin levels, the same neurochemical that bonds parents to infants, that bonds dogs to humans. It lowers the psychological barriers that make strangers feel like threats. It makes people more generous and more willing to extend trust to individuals outside their immediate family group. For small hunter-gatherer bands beginning to aggregate into the first large human communities, fermented grain beverages may have provided something biologically irreplaceable. Not calories alone, not intoxication as an end, but a repeatable social ritual that made sustained, large-scale cooperation neurologically easier. A shared drink was a form of social technology, one of the oldest ever developed. And once humans stayed in one place long enough to need more of it, they needed more grain. More grain meant deliberate cultivation. Cultivation meant clearing land, selecting seeds, watering, waiting, watching the seasons with a purpose they hadn't needed before. Farming, by this interpretation, did not create beer. Beer created farming. Or at least, the desire for beer helped push nomadic humans over the threshold into settling down. It is worth being honest about something here. The beer hypothesis is not universally accepted, and the science is still developing. Some archaeologists argue that bread came first, or that grain cultivation served multiple purposes simultaneously from the beginning. Others point out that evidence for ancient baking is roughly as old as evidence for ancient brewing, making it difficult to establish a clean sequence. But that debate may be missing the larger point entirely. Whether beer came first or bread came first, both required the same fundamental shift in human behavior. Humans had to stop moving. They had to commit to a place. They had to invest labor in a process whose rewards wouldn't arrive for months. That is a profound change in how a species relates to time, to place, and to each other. What the fermentation evidence suggests is that humans had strong reasons beyond simple hunger to make that commitment. Grain was not just food. It was the raw material for something that also held communities together, eased cooperation between strangers, and gave people a reason to gather in the same location season after season. Once they were settled, bread followed naturally. The same grain, the same grinding tools. A slightly different process, and the result was solid rather than liquid. But bread required a fully established food culture to seem like an obvious choice. Beer required only a container, wet grain, wild yeast, and time. Now, ancient beer looked almost nothing like what you would recognize from a modern bottle. Forget the cold, clear liquid. Forget the carbonation. Forget the bitterness of modern hops, which weren't added to beer at all until the Middle Ages. Ancient beer was closer to a warm, thick, murky grain porridge with a mild alcoholic content, probably between 1 and 3%. It was rich in calories. It was loaded with B vitamins and probiotics produced by the fermentation process. It was nutritionally meaningful in a way that water simply wasn't. And to drink it, you needed a straw. The grain husks and sediment that floated throughout ancient beer made drinking directly from a vessel unpleasant and often impossible. Archaeologists have recovered drinking tubes made from reed, bone, and gold across sites in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. In some of the oldest visual records humans ever created, cylinder seals and wall carvings from Sumer show groups of people gathered around a large clay vessel, each person holding a long straw reaching down into the liquid. This was not an exotic practice. It was how beer was consumed for thousands of years across multiple civilizations simultaneously. The nutritional value of ancient beer was genuinely significant. Fermentation breaks down phytic acid present in raw grain, making vitamins and minerals far more bioavailable than they would be in unprocessed form. In a food environment where nutrient deficiency was a constant threat, fermented grain delivered calories, hydration, and micronutrients that could sustain heavy labor in a single beverage. It was also, critically, safer than water. Before sanitation, before the germ theory of disease, before any understanding of what contamination meant, water sources near human settlements were routinely dangerous. Streams, wells, and rivers in heavily populated areas were contaminated with pathogens from human and animal waste. Dysentery, typhoid, and waterborne infections were among the most persistent killers in ancient populations. The fermentation process, even at low alcohol levels, kills a significant portion of waterborne pathogens. People who drank fermented beverages regularly instead of raw water in contaminated environments got sick less often, not because they understood microbiology, because evolution had been selecting for tolerance of fermented substances for 10 million years, and fermentation itself happened to destroy the things that were killing people. Ancient beer was medicine. This is why it appears not only in feasting records, but in medical texts, ration documents, and religious offerings across multiple ancient civilizations. By the time humanity began keeping written records, fermented grain beverages were so deeply embedded in daily life that they had become inseparable from culture, governance, and spiritual practice. The oldest known written recipe in human history is not for bread. It is not for stew or soup or any kind of food. It is a recipe for beer. A Sumerian poem dating back approximately 4,000 years, called the Hymn to Ninkasi, addressed to the Sumerian goddess of brewing, contains within its lines a complete, practical set of instructions for fermenting barley into beer. A religious text and a brewing manual simultaneously. The oldest thing humans ever felt compelled to write down and preserve was how to make a drink. In ancient Egypt, the relationship between fermented grain and organized civilization was not symbolic. It was administrative. Archaeological records from the work site near the pyramids of Giza contain detailed ration accounts for the laborers who built them. Each worker received a daily allocation that included bread and beer. Approximately 4 to 5 liters of beer per worker per day. The pyramids were not built on inspiration or divine mandate alone. They were built on grain economy, and beer was currency within that economy. Workers accepted it as payment. Overseers distributed it as reward. Brewers occupied a recognized professional role within the administrative hierarchy of the ancient Egyptian state. Some of the most powerful monuments in human history were raised by people whose daily compensation included fermented grain. In Mesopotamia, the complexity deepened further. Different grades of beer existed for different social ranks. Basic grain beer for laborers, refined, flavored varieties for priests and rulers. Beer appeared as tribute, as offering, as diplomatic currency exchanged between kingdoms. The production, distribution, and consumption of fermented grain beverages was regulated by law, tracked in accounting records, and embedded in religious ceremony. Alcohol was not a distraction from civilization. It was part of its infrastructure. Your brain responds to a drink tonight with the same chemistry it used 13,000 years ago. The same dopamine circuits light up. The same oxytocin rises. The same threat detection circuits quiet slightly. the same gradual softening of the distance between strangers. This is not a coincidence. This is not a cultural artifact of the modern world. This is biology that predates farming, predates writing, predates the first permanent building ever constructed on Earth. The preference for fermentation was built into the primate line millions of years before the first human ever stood upright on a savanna. Every time two people sit down together and share a drink, they are running software that is older than language, older than fire in a hearth, older than the first deliberate seed placed in ground, the trust that built the first monuments, that organized the first cities, that kept strangers working together long enough to create something none of them could have built alone, ran partly through shared fermented grain, held in a clay jar, and passed around a fire at the edge of a world none of us would recognize. There is something strange and specific about the act of sharing a drink that no other exchange quite replicates. Sharing food is generosity. Sharing warmth is necessity. But sharing a fermented beverage with someone is a particular kind of signal. It says, "I trust what I have given you. I am willing to be slightly vulnerable alongside you. I am choosing to lower my guard near you specifically." For social species navigating a world of constant uncertainty, that signal was not trivial. It was a small act of civilization. Done 1,000 times a day across thousands of years, it accumulated into something enormous. Somewhere in the dark, 13,000 years ago, someone left wet grain in a stone mortar and forgot about it for a few days. When they came back, something had changed. They tasted it. They felt what it did, and they shared it with whoever was nearby. That moment, small, accidental, completely unremarkable to the person standing there, may have set in motion the chain of events that produced every city, every government, every written law, every piece of music, every structure, every act of organized human cooperation that has existed since. Not because of the alcohol, because of the sharing. The next time someone hands you a drink, they have no idea how old that gesture actually is. But now you do.